Thank you for your very interesting talk. There's a big movement in the government schools to have virtual classrooms with tablets and teachers from outside teaching. Do you think that that is an option in the future? Also, a lot of careers are now becoming obsolete with the digital age, and would teachers become obsolete with visual classrooms?
Yeah. So I think I was wondering whether or not I should bring in things like artificial intelligence and the kind of advances that have been made in robotics, because it heavily influences inequality. Who gets what under a particularly technological, it's likely to exacerbate inequality, because the people that have the technology and benefit from it come from that top 20%, and even from the elite, as opposed to the full 20%. To answer your question about whether or not teachers will be replaced, I love a quote. It says, teachers that can be replaced by computers or robots should be. And that's basically my view, is they won't. Good teachers will never be replaced. It's also one of the reasons why, as much as I back certain straight-to-pupil interventions, like tablets, reading eggs, mathletics, whatever it is, that go directly to the students, and in a sense bypass the teacher, one of the reasons why I don't think it's a long-term solution is what happens after that? If you've short-circuited the teacher development route, what happens when they move on from that particular app, and maybe they can read now, which is amazing, and it may be justified in and of itself? What happens when you need them to critique this, or when they have to do poetry, or they have to do something that you actually do need a teacher to do? If we've been bypassing teachers the whole time, you're not going to have teachers that can then do that. So I think I would probably say I'm not against it. I think we do need them, but it's not a solution to try and bypass teachers by using technology. Teachers should be empowered to use the technology to supplement, and maybe even to give them time to do teacher development. While the kid is using this, teachers are required to then go and do teacher development that improves their content knowledge, as opposed to going and sitting in the staff room or just watching.
Right, we move on. Where's the next one? Cool. By the way, I know a lot of you have seen me doing auctions, etc. Please don't be shy. If during the doctor's answer, if you want to put up your hand, I'm not going to sell you anything. I can just get to you quicker with a microphone.
Good evening, everybody.
Sorry, operator problem.
No problem. Good evening, everybody. I actually want to add something to blended learning. I come from a university, so my background is obviously not secondary or primary. But what we do is we actually help students with blended learning to catch up on the areas that they lack. So if we're doing end-user computing, for example, they would work at a place that is comfortable to them, so they'd have extra access time to the materials, which will help the lecturer actually work on the student's level where they are at. So blended learning has a positive, but it has a negative as well. The negative, however, is what happens to the student that is so slow that cannot catch up with the work in stipulated time, that being 6 months. So that is the problem that we have to face. Is number one, is the quality of the student being produced to the tertiary level, secondary and primary. And the other thing that we need to look at as well is how can we use technology to actually aid? Technology is not the evil. It's the person that operates it that's the evil. So that is what we need to take in mind when it comes to blended learning. So please, guys, blended learning, technology itself, if used correctly, brilliant. If used incorrectly, not the best thing under the sun.
Thanks.
Excellent. Comments?
No, I think it was just a comment. It's interesting, yeah.
Here we go, the man with the red shirt. Thank you, Squire.
Thank you. I just want to appreciate the question. Most of the things that you said is actually what we went through. So the mic seems to be cutting. Maybe if I can come closer. It's basically what we went through. I've been through a very, very poor school. Struggling to read the way you showed it there. That's how it went with ourselves. When I arrived at the university, it was very difficult because firstly I needed to learn English first before I can actually start learning the course content. And that was very difficult because you're struggling with English, you don't even understand the English, you can't even construct a paragraph in good English. And when you write, after that you give it to the lecturer, it comes all red. And that, it has came all the way through, as you showed it on the workplace, also how it affected in the workplace. And that has come through into our workplace, because even when you write a report now, that report is not properly. And I think that's one thing that we need to accept, and also to say, how can we deal with that? But the question that I have is that, how can schools like these ones, that are good schools, how can they make impact in terms of supporting the nearby poor schools from black communities? And also, I heard you talking about something like 15% that could be charged, maybe for instance, in schools like this ones, in order to support the poor schools out there with the resources, or maybe share resources with such schools, or in order to improve the quality of education and probably with the results that we can actually receive coming from that very same schools.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, that comment. The question about what can well-resourced schools like Penryn do, I think Penryn is actually a very good example with the Penn Reach Trust, that it is doing a hell of a lot more than the vast majority of independent schools of similar means. So I think Penryn is actually doing a lot of good. However, I do think that schools like Penryn and others can be doing a lot more than they're currently doing. And I'll answer in a vague way, which is, I think we need to change our understanding of the we and the they. So whenever you speak to teachers, there's a we of as soon as a student is considered my student or our student or a Penryn kid or whatever it is, we move the earth to make sure that they can read, they've got books. If they're not reading, they're coming to afternoon classes. All sorts of things are happening because they're part of the we. Whereas if they're part of the they, millions of other kids in other schools, the 1 million kids in Mpumalanga that aren't in Penryn, there's very little obligation to do something about that. And some of that's practical, right? It's very difficult to figure out how you do that. I think that I don't think it's only about resources. So when you said maybe we can say collect an additional X% from a school like Penryn to use that money to do development, I think a huge part of this is actually about teachers and teacher content knowledge and know-how and management and principles and the non-financial resources that schools like this have that could be used to develop other schools. I do think that we could be doing more, and one example that has been toyed and spoken about and I think has got a lot of merit is saying legislating all schools, public and private, independent, that charge fees are required to accept at least X%, say 10%, of kids that can pay no fees whatsoever. So yes, that would lead to an onus on parents, like I'm assuming there's some Penryn parents here, that resources would be distributed more because you would have a smaller number of fees paying for a larger number of students, or the same number of fees paying for a larger number of students. However, it would be happening to all schools. It would be happening to the school, it would be happening at Uplands, it would be happening at Hilton, it will be happening at the school that's charging 1,000 Rand a month. It doesn't address the fundamental problem, though, which is you still only have 15% of those schools. So you can get an additional 1.5% of kids into those schools. That make a massive difference, right? We shouldn't underestimate it just because it's only 150,000 kids. For those 150,000 kids, it's the world. It's literally the railway track for them and their entire extended family and network that will then have access to jobs in the labor market and whatever. But I think that the reason why I haven't focused too much on solutions here is I think there needs to be a shared consensus amongst the board, amongst the council, amongst the school governing body in Model C schools, that we have to be doing a hell of a lot more voluntarily before we are forced to do it by the government. And that's why I'm trying to emphasize the moral part of this rather than the technical side of like, do you have to do it yet? No, it doesn't. The schools don't have to do it. It's a question of, well, do you raise your hand and say, we'll do it, because we buy into it, even though it means we have to do more with less. And I think that's something which schools like Penryn can do soon.
Cool. Our next question comes from right in the middle at the back, which means the good doc is not going to be able to see us.
Nick, good evening. Am I on the mic? Like always, it's nice to listen to you. Nick, I think the one gap in our current system is that we tend to think for somebody to be successful in life, you need a university education. And I'm of the view that our vocational education sector is where a lot of our challenges lie. That learner that can't go to university what is his or her other options. Together with that, you must also realize that some of the students that arrive at university, I think ma'am said something about that, the quality of that matric pass that gave me a bachelor's. I perhaps got a bachelor's, but I didn't get a good bachelor's, so I arrive at the tertiary with a backlog. And those are the challenges. So I just want to emphasize what you are saying. The quality of starting with ECD is where the key lies, and then moving through.
Yeah.
I heard you spoke about fee-paying schools. I don't think it's always about that. The fact that the fees play that role. I think it's a matter of whoever is in charge of an institution and the institutional character of that school. Thanks.
So I think there were two questions there. I'll answer them in the reverse. I agree with you that it's not just about the fees and the resources that you get from the fees. That being said, in South Africa, I'll be very interested for you to find me a very functional, no-fee primary school. We've just done a study. We're trying to find outlier township and rural schools, quintile 1 to 3 schools in Limpopo, KZN, and Gauteng, and we couldn't find any. So now that's not saying that they don't exist, right? We've written up papers about our search methodology, and we really, really, really tried hard to find these schools. The point is, at the moment, the way that resources, not just financial resources, school resources, infrastructure, which teachers and principals decide to go and work in which schools, means that the best principals and the best teachers, or the most qualified or the most experienced, or whatever metric you want to use, are not going into no-fee schools. And that's an incentive question. In Rio, in Brazil, you get paid 150% of your salary if you teach in a favela and you classify it as a high-performing teacher. South Africa, you get exactly the same if you're teaching in a very functional school or a very dysfunctional school, or if you're teaching the most able kid, who the parents have been reading to that kid since they were 0, versus a kid who's got all the challenges in life. It's much more difficult to educate this student than it is to educate this student. And what are we doing? We allocate our best teachers in the smallest classes with the most resources to educate the ones that need it the least. Right? That's basically what we do. It's not saying they don't need it. It's just saying if you look at the types of disadvantage that some kids face, social, emotional problems at home, abuse, nutrition, all sorts of issues, which is documented, well documented, that these are correlates of poverty, not the households and types of households. It's particularly around poverty and unemployment. And yet we then go and give them the least resources to deal with those students. You asked also a question about universities. I wanted to link that to, at the moment at universities, we don't discriminate between where students come from. If you get 70% for maths and you attended Penryn, or you get 70% for maths, okay, this is a bad example because Penryn does IEB, but if you took a state school where they got 70% for maths, and it was a fee-charging school charging 35,000 Rand a year fees, say, and another student that attending a rural no-fee school, 70 kids in the class, like ridiculous odds, and that kid also gets 70% for maths. What do we at university do? We say, you got 70% for maths. We take no account of the fact that this was a quintile 1 kid, this is a quintile 5 kid. This one has educated parents, a class size of 25, whatever it might be, whereas this one has had to come over incredible odds to get the same 70%. It's not saying that we can't do it. We could very easily say this particular 70% from a quintile 1 school means you get additional points. We allocate scholarships or whatever it is. And your last point about vocational, I totally agree. I always say if there's one thing that's more dysfunctional than our schooling system, it's the vocational system. They have throughput rates of things like 5% in some vocational colleges. But you still have, even with the vocational colleges, even if those kids that went into vocational colleges graduated and got degrees, you still have 60% of kids that have zero qualification about anything, any proof of their educational status. Not even like a matric pass, 60%. And that's why I'm 100% agree with you. ECD, early childhood development, and early grade reading, if we don't get the foundations right, it doesn't matter what we do later in the system. The horse is bolted. You can't do remedial backlog. You can't catch up 4 to 5 years in maths and language in grade 9 or grade 10. Matric, we have to do, the matric catch-up classes. You can't do 5 years of catch-up for hundreds of thousands of kids. You can do it with one kid, do it with 2 kids. You can't do it with 500,000 kids. Whereas you can get reading right in the first 3 years of school.
Great, we're back down here in the middle. I'm on the floor. We've got a question here. I've got one behind me. After that, I'll start looking around again. I've got the lady over there. Great.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Sanjay. I'm just taking us back to the concept of shared vision. And the presentation was excellent. I mean, it's always good to have facts and statistics like that. How does that link to shared vision? Because that is content. We talked about content and the way teachers teach and how they will do whatever. But the key issue for me is a value system. And an issue of attitude. If we have to have a shared vision, well, I can tell you this much. A lot of us, including myself, must go and look in the mirror and reevaluate what my value system is and how much I buy into this concept of a shared vision or a vision for a South Africa like this. How do I see it? So I think it's something that we will all, breathe very heavily, because it's not an easy question to answer. The lives we've led in our different areas of how we were brought up and the belief systems we have in this day and age, it's very difficult to break out of that mold. So I think if we're going to move towards a shared vision, we probably have a big battle. But if we can instill this slowly into our kids, of a shared vision and a common South Africa, perhaps somewhere this dream will be a reality.
Definitely.
That's the one. The second part is, okay, how come in Germany they speak German and they do good business in the world? In Japan and China, they do the same. And then when we come to South Africa, we have English as the language of business, or Afrikaans as the language of business. Yet the demographics of the country says, well, there's a vast population that is black African who speak indigenous language. Could we not be failing ourselves, especially at that ECD level, in terms of the expectations around what we're teaching and what the expectations are from those kids, given the background of what education their parents might have had. Thank you.
Yeah. So just a quick note on, I don't know if everyone is aware of how we got our 11 languages, but the original ANC policy, when you looked at it, was one national language, which was English. They said this was a compromise, we're going to go with English. The National Party at the time, during the negotiation, said it has to have Afrikaans as well. It has to be English and Afrikaans. And obviously the ANC said over our dead bodies, is it going to be English and Afrikaans? You have to add Zulu. And when you add Zulu, what do all the Sotho? They say, you have to have Sepedi, or you have to have Setswana, or you have to have Sotho. And then, it kept going back and forth, and that's how we got 11, basically. Now that we have 11, and that's quite a rare instance, by the way, that we have 11 official languages, not that we have 11 languages. Lots of countries have multiple languages. The fact that they are all official in South Africa is the peculiarity. I think that the majority, so 70% of kids in South Africa are learning in either their mother tongue or a very close African language to their mother tongue. It's only a minority of students that start their schooling career in English. Okay? The big problem is that they're not learning to read even in that language. So if I'm a Chivenda parent and I send my student to a Venda school, they're not learning to read in Venda, even though the language of instruction, the teacher's Venda, the books are Venda, the workbooks are Venda, they're not learning to read in Venda. And that's the same with multiple of the other languages. So it's not just a language issue. It's not just that only after we switch is there a big problem in English. It's even before the switch in those languages. So those stats that I showed you about not learning to read for meaning, those are all 11 languages. So a kid that learned in Chivenda was tested in Chivenda and couldn't read for meaning. Your example of Japan and Germany, etc., they are also fluent in English. There's no country that I know of where they are only fluent in their language and they're the only ones that speak that language. French is probably the closest example to that, where you could find, but that's because of the Francophone world, where you could actually do business with the whole of West Africa. If you're only speaking Sepedi, where are you doing business with the rest of the world? That's not to say that we should abandon multilingualism. I think Kelly, the person who's been driving me around while I've been here, speaks 12 languages. I told him I speak like 1.2 languages. I don't speak Afrikaans properly. And the point is, I'm like, this doesn't hinder me, and he's not rewarded for the fact that he can converse to basically whoever comes into the room. It's incredible. So I think that the multilingualism part of it, and the bilingualism and biliterate, not just bilingual, but we need kids that are biliterate. They can read and write in both languages. That's the way forward, rather than a hegemonic English or Afrikaans solution. And it really is possible to do both. And I think schools like Penryn, there's another flip side, where a lot of the students might be home language English, or not fluent in coming and not being taught in an African home language, should be forced, in my view. You know this whole additional African language thing that the department's introducing? In my view, that should have only been implemented in formerly white schools, or you could just do fee charging schools. It should have been a requirement. Going to a school where they're not even teaching reading in one language and now forcing them to add other languages is ridiculous. And many of those schools are already bilingual, the kids. Whereas the real challenge is there's a whole bunch of kids, people like me, that were never given the opportunity or required to become fluent in an African language, even though I live in South Africa and I'm South African. Why is that? How does that fit into our shared vision, shared future thing? Language is a huge part of culture and identity and making us feel like we actually do have a shared vision and that your language and culture is valuable, not just you using that so that you can learn English.
I love the fact the gentleman started off with a difficult question, because unless the question is difficult, the ideas are not going to be big. So keep those difficult questions going.
Thank you. Thank you for a well-researched topic. Something that came up as a conversation between my husband and I last night, he came home and he said a client of his wants to sponsor a child, an underprivileged child, to go to one of the private schools. And my immediate reaction to that was, how will that child cope? Coming from a disadvantaged family, from a poor area, and being put into some place like Penryn would be an absolute shock to a child. That, never mind the education that they obviously would benefit from, but what about the social factors?
Yeah.
Coming from poverty, being exposed to children who are cruel. I mean, they're nasty to each other. They haven't been maybe educated on how to deal with that. What studies have been done around that?
So I think you're 100% right in saying that when you're making that consideration, it's not just a question of what are the fees. In other words, the person might say, I can afford whatever it is, 50,000, 70,000 a year plus the uniform, and that's what my contribution is to pay for a kid to come to Penryn and do well. There's a huge part of this that's psychosocial and cultural. And I was speaking to the Penryn, Penreach, various people, because there are examples of this already at Penryn. And the older the children get, the more they struggle. It's the primary school is not as bad nearly as the high school phase for various reasons. I think that my response wouldn't be don't do it. It would be make sure that the parents are 100% behind what you're doing. It's not the parents of the child that actually wants this. It's not just like, we'll let you do this, as opposed to like, we really are 100% behind this. That you're 100% upfront with how difficult it is going to be, because you become kind of culturally and socio-economically schizophrenic of needing to be different in different places. And the other major third challenge is actually on the school. There are some really, really good schools that find a way of making sure that it is never ever identified where it is possible which schools are, which students are on financial support or not. Things like WhatsApp groups. There's a student that attends Renish Primary in Stellenbosch. And I was talking to one of the parents who's paying for the student to go there, and she's like, it's things like, doesn't have a cell phone. Do you know what I mean? So then, and they now, every time something like this comes up, they then host a discussion where they say, okay, in future, before we accept a student, we need to provide them with a cell phone, we need to provide them with not just the uniform, because there are various other things that are going along with this, and these are just the physical things. What about things like bring a book from home? It's like, what happens if you don't have books? Is every single teacher aware of this And is the principal and the deputy principal and head of academics and etc. sufficiently aware that this is a school-wide project to make sure that we are more socioeconomically diverse and we make it a super welcoming space for those people, offer additional psychosocial support, get more people from those communities to come and speak about what those challenges might be, getting old girls and old boys that have been through it to come back and say, what would you wish to have had but didn't have, and that you now can advise us to do differently for these kids. I think that the world, it makes the world of literally the world of difference for students that can get access to a school like that, like this.
Great. We bottom left, stage right, and can have a look at the range and see how we're doing, organizer. Cool.
Well, I think I had one question, and then after I listened to everybody's comments, I almost want to jump into so many things. I just wanted to say to the lady who just asked the question, I think I consider myself a clear example of something like that, where somebody sponsored me, because as the gentleman said, a lot of us are very familiar when we look at these stats. It's a norm. And maybe we are that 4% or that has moved, maybe able to move through the ranks. But having done that little bit has an impact. It's like a catalyst. Everybody else in the family begins to realize the differences. And it's not always that people aren't able to pay, but paying is also a huge sacrifice, and they would potentially make that difference in the community. So I would definitely support that. But my question to you, Nick, I think one of the prominent things you said is we are running out of time, and we are talking about this foundation phase that we need to develop. And my question to you would be, would it not make an impact if we started to involve parents? You know, what you've just shown us, I think me and my husband just looked at each other and it made sense. I know at grade 4 I didn't know how to read. We're sitting doing our dissertations, everybody's speed reading and catching up. You know, though educationally you still would bracket us in that upper market, you know, that is educated. It's still a struggle. And I've seen how helping my little grade 1 kid with trust is actually helping me how to read. And I know there's a lot of interventions we do in the community with the kids. But I mean, parents have cell phones, and all of those, if we're talking about time limitations, how about we look at interventions of speaking to parents? And I think a lot of the times, people be like, we are very busy, mothers are running around, and there's no time. But we all don't have time. And I think those conversations about how do I manage making time to sit with my child to read, because helping them also helps me. It will delay that strike one day, because as you say, we're talking about time. Then people aren't going to be waiting for these grade 3s to see the difference when they're matric one day. But if we can involve the parents to see that shared vision, potentially we can start having conversations, and they can actually potentially also see the direction. Because we always say, you know, when the wise are quiet, the wicked start to rule, and there's a big gap that grows. So I don't know if you guys have looked at that interventions without it just being financial, as we always look at it.
So I think definitely there's a lot of research, not just South African research, international research about the importance of parents and the home environment, and particularly the early literacy experience. Because it's not like we start reading at day 1, grade R. That's nonsense, right? Kids' exposure to what parents are saying, whether or not they're read to, the disposition towards books. Are books valuable things? Is reading valuable? The vocabulary, the oral language proficiency that you have, all of that is first 1,000 days and then some. Do you know what I mean? So you have to absolutely get that right. I think the reason why I'm really focusing on teachers, I say there's 2 things that I don't judge other people if they're working on it too harshly. The one is ECD, and the second one is on the environment, because that's another global warming and climate change and all that kind of stuff. If people are working on other things, I'm like, it's not nearly as important as what I'm doing. Whereas if it's ECD on the environment, I'm like, I'm hands off. You know, we may not have a world, and ECD is, I think, the kind of holy grail. The difference with teachers is we've got a captive audience. They get paid a salary. It is their job to teach kids how to read. It's not parents' job. It's parents' jobs to read to kids. But the technical skills of how kids learn to read, teachers need to know that. Because also the number of hours that a kid is exposed to their foundation phase teacher over the foundation phase is way more in terms of official, explicit, didactic teaching time for reading than the parents have with their kid. Okay? Not total parent time, teaching time. And that's why we have to make sure that it happens at least with the teachers. Definitely we need parent and ECD interventions. The one thing, just that there were 2 mentions of people that have self-identified to say we were those people that have made it through. It's also really important, I think, that kids that haven't made it through yet see those role model examples. So there's an organization called Ikamva Youth that does work in Cape Town and various other places where township youth, they work specifically in Khayelitsha, that have made it through the schooling system and made it to university and are now studying at university, come and tutor voluntarily, not paid, kids that are in the townships that come to this Ikamva Youth time. And we did an evaluation of it, and we realized that you actually can't replace these students with well-meaning housewives or whatever it is, because there isn't the same sense of like, you used to live down the road from me, and you're now at UCT. That we can't measure it. It's really difficult to measure, but it's a super important, tangible thing of like, it's possible that someone exactly like me has made it through the system. And I think building in, again, coming back to your question, building in some kind of alumni of not just people made it through and are now out and away, but getting those people to come back and paying for their trips to come back to mentor and have sessions where they talk with students about what are the struggles that you face. I face the same struggles. And having those kinds of conversations, not with a random therapist or counselor, but someone who's actually done it and been there, not saying that that's not important. It's probably also important. I'm a big fan of therapy as well, but it's really important for that, just as a side note.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure we once again all agree it's a fascinating topic, and it will bear a lot of conversation. One of the attractions of TED Talk, one of the attractions we hope of PENTalk, is going to be big ideas at the same time within a manageable time frame. So we did promise you we're going to pack it in by around about 8 o'clock. We are running up against that. I'm going to shoot another question, and I think we'll do one more over there. After that, and I know there are a bunch of people so sorry already, but it goes to, we can start an auction just now. Seriously though, we did ask at the beginning to please take this onto social media, and if you could find the event and post your questions there, and we'll see if we can get answers and keep the conversation going on social media, just so that we can keep this format to what it was intended to be. And I know some people are going to hate me, but that's fine. You made the comment about teachers being replaced, and he's the guy in the CA car, so he's easier to find. Our second last question.
Nick, sorry. I just want to ask, as you said, without facts, it's just an opinion. And whether it's your opinion or whether it's fact, we've got early childhood development on the one side and the ticking time bomb on the other, like the fees must fall. Where do we draw the line? When is that time bomb going to explode? Because we certainly don't have, let's take someone who's in grade 000 now and they get in a 4-year degree, that's probably 20 years. We don't have it. So where do you draw the line?
Yeah. So one of the people in the department, Stephen Taylor, and I often talk about, how you get ableism, discrimination against people with disabilities, or ageism, whatever, and ageism typically refers to older people. We say there's a massive amount of political ageism in South Africa because young kids can't vote. Do you know what I mean? Kids that are from 0 to 18 have no political interest or political representation outside of their parents or caregivers. And therefore their interests are systematically maligned compared to the people that can vote. Right? But I think the answer to your question, they're not as disjointed as you might think. I think if we made really meaningful progress, if there was a genuine feel of like we are on an upward trajectory, there's a lot that's being done to give equal life chances for kids that are coming from very poor rural background and kids that are coming from a super privileged wealthy background, that we're closing that gap and we're making significant dents in this. I do think that that's not unrelated to fees must fall type protests. Because the types of conversations that you can have in the political realm, and that's the question at the front here, was asking about this, about vision, a shared vision and morality. These are political questions. There's a political discussion that we're having about inequality and what needs to happen. People that will capture that political narrative of kind of South Africa improving, advancing, becoming more equal, becoming more just than it has been in the past, I think partly diffuses or buys time in the ticking time bomb in the fees must fall type space. The problem with the fees must fall type space is you can follow that golden thread throughout and you will find no disjuncture. It's a continuous thread. Whether you're looking at schooling, it's dysfunctional high schools. You go into primary schooling, you go into maternal care and healthcare, there's an unbroken thread. There's no that's where it breaks. There is this generation, which we would have liked to have been the 1994 kind of Rainbow Nation, whatever that thing was. It would have been great if that was it. They weren't. In some ways, there was a group that made it out of that, definitely, and have become part of a black middle class, but it wasn't the majority. And I think what we're saying now is it needs to be the majority. And if we're asking where to intervene, you cannot intervene at matric. You have to intervene early. That doesn't mean we do nothing for vocational and whatever, but in terms of where we have to get it right, we can't afford to keep getting it wrong and shooting ourselves in the foot in 10 years' time when those students have zero life opportunities, 50% youth unemployment, no dignified employment, even when they get employment. That's a ticking time bomb as well. So I don't think they're as unrelated as we might think. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
It reminds me of an expression I've always loved very much, which is to say that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time to plant it is today.
It's today, yeah.
Hi, Nick. In terms of getting back to the parent matter, we were looking at starting a school at some point, and they said if you want to start a perfect school, all you need to ask is, does a mother have a college degree? It was actually one of the questions. So have you done a study where you've taken a functional teacher from a school such as this with low class size and put them in a rural school, and taken a teacher from a rural school and put them in a school like this? Because I imagine there's nothing more incentivizing to a teacher than having 500 angry parents telling you to raise your game, which you would find in a school like Penryn, and which you wouldn't find in a rural school.
It's assuming you can raise your game, right? So I think this is... No, there's not stats on moving a teacher like that. There's some anecdotal evidence, which I'll mention now. But what we do have evidence of is there was a nationally representative sample, SUCMEC, from 2007, which tested the grade 6 maths teachers, not just the grade 6 kids, on maths and reading. 79%, 400 teachers got tested. 79% of the grade 6 maths teachers couldn't get 60% correct on a grade 6 test. Nationally representative. So you can't take that teacher that can't do fractions, place it in a school like Penryn and think that having 500 angry parents is going to somehow make them into a great maths teacher. I think there are really, really fundamental issues around the access to high quality, meaningful learning opportunities for existing teachers that are non-existent. The access to learning opportunities that teachers have at the moment, by and large, on the whole, are pathetic in terms of quality and dosage. Absolutely pathetic. That's one of the main reasons why I was like, I kind of have to take myself out of blaming teachers until we can give them an opportunity to improve their own skills. Basically, you can't hold people accountable for things they can't do. You have to capacitate before you hold accountable. It's not to say we shouldn't hold accountable. You put a gun to my head and say, fly around the room or you'll get shot, I'll be like, shoot me. Can't do it. And I think the problem is when you ask people to do things they can't do, what do? Subvert aims, get angry, strike. When you are in a vulnerable position and someone wants to clamp down on you in accountability, you don't just sit there and be like, okay, I'll just succumb. If you can't do the things that you're being expected to do of the accountability regime. So that's the one question. I can't remember moving the teachers. Anecdotally, I would never put one teacher in a dysfunctional school. That's like a recipe for disaster. And I have friends that have done this. They've gone to a dysfunctional school as the one really amazing, brilliant teacher, and they last between 6 months and 3 years, and they usually have a burnout period. Because they try and apply the level of education that you're offering at Penryn in a very dysfunctional school where the level that this kid starts at isn't here, it's here, and you have 50. And you're the only one doing it. So then you're offering remedial classes every single night until 7 to make sure that these kids are getting up to grade level or whatever it is. I would only ever move teachers like that if it was a group of teachers or if it was a totally new school or a different setup. But I think you get swallowed by a dysfunctional system because all schools have an equilibrium. It might not be a good equilibrium, but it is an equilibrium. You coming in as a single teacher are not going to change that. If you're coming in as 4 or 5 teachers with backing and kind of this was actually a deliberate thing, I think you actually can change it. But one teacher is much more likely to get swallowed than it is to change the school. And moving a teacher from a dysfunctional school to a school like this, I think under most circumstances would be very difficult to get right. That's not saying that I think we should be doing a lot more internships and twinning, voluntary twinning, by the way, not this forced twinning that they tried in Gauteng. It's like you will go with you. It's not a recipe for success. And also, the other speaking about solutions, something which I'm increasingly in favor of is rather than just picking random schools to intervene and random teachers to intervene, is like help the people that want help. Too often we're trying to help people that actually don't want the help. And you end up wasting loads of time and resources and effort trying to get them to come to something that they don't want to do. That's not saying that in the beginning you say, you didn't come, you clearly don't want it. There's also intervention fatigue. If I've been involved in so many useless things, it actually takes a while for me to realize that you're committed. You're going to stay here for 5 years or 3 years. But once that's in, you've got my 100% buy-in. But if you've got a total bad egg that doesn't want help, don't spend all your time trying to get them to come around. You can lead a horse to water, you're not going to make it drink. We would also take that approach of like helping people that want help.
Here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Nic Spaull.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, sir.